trillions of dollars of value vanished overnight. So terrified was the American government at what might happen as a consequence of all the people, all the companies, all the pension funds, all the state and local governments who had invested in stocks whose value collapsed, that the government, you remember a man named Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve at the time, rushed in and took an unprecedented step. They pumped vast amounts of money into the economy, and they dropped the interest rates faster and further than had ever been done before. By the time 9/11 happens, we have an economy that the government is boosting by dramatically lowering interest rates and filling the economy full of money in the hope that the crash of the stock market wouldn't produce a general economic collapse. And in a peculiar way, this policy worked. By making money so cheap, it gave to the American business community and to the American consumer a kind of free ride for 6 or 7 years. Your wages weren't going up. Your company's ability to make money wasn't doing all that well, but you could borrow money from the federal government limitlessly in quantity at a very, very low price. And what industry benefited most from that? The housing industry. It became possible for millions and millions of Americans to buy a house because they could borrow huge amounts of money, pay very little interest, and it produced a housing boom, roughly from the year 2001 to 2007. Houses were built everywhere, and they were paid for by people who didn't have much wealth, but who were now, in a very peculiar way, able to take advantage of the program to cope with the stock market crash by borrowing to buy a house. And it kept the thing alive. But like any palliative that keeps alive a defunct economic situation, when it postpones the day of reckoning, it makes that day much more harsh when it comes. So what we had was a bubble exploding in the stock market, but we rescued the economy by producing another bubble in the real estate market. But when the real estate market bubble burst, 2007, there was nothing left to make another bubble with. And then we had what we had. So we have a situation in which this crisis is peculiarly a crisis that begins and sweeps across the housing industry, real estate, which is why every major neighborhood in New York City has empty stores that you see sitting there for long periods of time. That's why millions of houses are empty in the United States. Homes are empty. We have that wonderful capitalist efficiency in which we have people without homes side by side with homes without people, and we can't, as an economic system, put these two things together. We have a foreclosure crisis. A foreclosure crisis, just to make sure you all understand, is when a person who has bought a home by borrowing money from a bank or from a lender is unable to make the monthly payments to repay the lender for the loan that allowed you to get into the house. And basically what the lender eventually does, if you don't pay, is the lender goes to court to initiate a legal procedure. That's what's called a foreclosure, in which basically the lender asks the judicial system, the court, to either force you to make the payments you owe on the money you borrowed, or else to throw you out of the building or the apartment or the house. When you are thrown out, the lender, the bank, takes the property, repossesses the house or the apartment, sells it to recover the loan, uses the proceeds from selling your house, you've been thrown out of the house. By the way, being thrown out of the house, for those of you not familiar with it, I mean that literally. The sheriff, a very obscure position in our culture, we have sheriffs. They are the ones who actually come and give you a piece of paper and tell you you have a few weeks to get out, and if you don't get out by those weeks, the same sheriff comes back with several large persons carrying sticks to persuade you quickly to leave, or else they will hit you with the sticks and they take your stuff out of the apartment, put it on the street, give you immediately a ticket because you're not allowed to have stuff on the street. And you now have to remove yourself and the stuff, or else you'll be arrested. But it's a very literal kind of process. Happening now to millions of people. The current rate of foreclosure documentation in our courts is running about 200 to 225,000 new foreclosure procedures per month in the United States. That's been going on for a long time. So, and there's no end in sight. The United States government, Obama, has tried at least 4 programs that I know of to try to ameliorate this situation, to reduce it, to lessen it. They haven't worked, mostly because they have to get the cooperation of the private lenders, and the private lenders don't want to cooperate. They want to recoup their money. So they are not interested in helping, and so the actual number of people helped, there are some, is a very small fraction of the total number of people that are affected by foreclosure. And consequently, that process, the housing market destruction process, is still in full procedure, just like the unemployment is. So nothing could better measure the seriousness of the crisis for the mass of people than unemployment and foreclosures, and those are up and have not gone down. Okay? So we are in a very serious crisis that affects huge numbers of people. A couple of other indices. These are not so well known, but they will become known in the next few weeks. You're familiar, I hope, with how the crisis in housing blew up our economy. Basically, the way this happened was as follows. Clever bankers back in the 1970s here in the United States, working with lawyers, came up with a new gimmick. Up until that time, Americans who wanted to buy a home confronted a fundamental problem. Not enough money. Well, it's very important you know this. The relationship between American working people and the incomes they could earn and the price of a home meant you couldn't buy one with what you earned. Nor could you go to a bank. Had that been possible, Americans would have done that. They couldn't. And the reason was very simple. No bank in its right mind would lend to an American worker. They didn't make enough money. It was real simple. And they had no collateral. What are you going to give? An American worker who lives in an apartment, a tenement, renting, has nothing to give a bank as the collateral for a loan. So Americans were not able, in fact, to live in their own homes. Most Americans were renters, say around the 1910s, 1920s. It was in the depths of the Great Depression that it became clear that one of the ways Roosevelt could get us out of a depressed economy was by creating suddenly a vast market for something that could be produced and could put people to work. And at that point was born the following idea. We could have Americans given the idea that they could own their own homes, what came to be known as the American dream. And the way it would become possible would be for the government to do something that had not been done before. And basically what the government did was to say to the private lenders of America, the banks, if you lend to a person to buy a home, you can either do one of two things. You can come to the government, and for a very small amount of money, we will basically insure that loan. So the government said, if Mr. and Mrs. Smith borrow money from you for a home, and they can't pay it back, we, the government, will pay it back. It removes from the bank the risk. They don't need the collateral from each of you because the government is basically substituted itself. A little later, they developed that in a new way, and they handle it differently. They said to the bank, here's what we'll do. You write the mortgage, you give the loan to the Smiths, And they write a little IOU, I promise for 15 years to pay you every month. And then you, the banker who made the mortgage, you sell that debt, that contract, to the government. And the government actually becomes the lender. The bank now has the money back it lent to you because the government gives it to them, and they can go find another person to do this too, and they make a little bit of money on each one, and it's very lucrative.